Hello class, today we're going to talk about the context of European expansion. Basically we're talking about the United States or North America before Columbus got there, so everything up to 1491, which is why this is titled 1491. Our objectives today are to briefly identify and describe the significance of each of these following terms, basically give a general background of what the lay of the land was like before Columbus discovered, quote-unquote, America. So, where do they come from? It's generally assumed that the Native Americans migrated to North America from Northeast Asia, from the Siberia area. There are a lot of factors that tell us that. Archaeologically, we have a trail of archaeological evidence that leads from that region, crossing over the Bering land bridge that would have been above water, given the amount of water that was locked in polar ice caps there. And so we assume that they would have come here from Asia. How did they get here? They got here basically walking, following herds of animals, hunting their way into North America. And how do we know this? Well, the first big evidence of ancient natives in North America was from the Clovis, New Mexico dig site. From the Clovis, New Mexico dig site, we got an idea of Native Americans that had an established culture, specifically in the way they designed their spear points and arrowhead points. They had a flute in the middle that allowed them to be hafted onto the shafts of spears. That made it more stable. You see that here. And these designs showed up quite regularly. It became quite prominent, and it became quite apparent that they were all across the United States. You see here the density of these sites all over, especially the eastern woodlands, but all over the United States and in Canada, all dating back to around 13,000 years ago. So when did they first arrive? Well, we assume they arrived before 13,000 years ago. If they were already this far dispersed across North America at 13,000, they would have had to have come prior to that, right? Well, exactly when gets a bit tricky once again. It's complicated. You see from this here estimate, we get about 25,000 years ago. Maybe, though, as late as 32,000 years ago. Genetically, we have evidence of groups of Native Americans decisively being here by 17,000 years ago, which would have put that in line for the Clovis culture. But there are possibly earlier migrations, and definitely we're seeing multiple migrations. It used to be that when I was in school, kiddos, the definitive theory was the ice-free corridor you see here as the darker of these two lines on the screen. The ice-free corridor was the definitive route, that there was some kind of icy-free corridor between the huge continental ice shelf coming down from central Canada and the ice shelf that was on the British Columbian mountain ranges, and that there was some free corridor, and the natives, like Moses leading the Israelites through the Red Sea, some early Native American tribes walked between these two walls of ice and plopped into North America and were, able to live well on all the game that they could hunt there. But what we're finding now is that there is a growing amount of evidence, not just genetically, but even archaeologically, of a possible earlier group coming down the coastlines. This is intriguing because a lot of the evidence for this would be now under about 200 feet of water. So it's very interesting. We do have some evidence. We don't have a lot of evidence, and it's likely that a lot of that evidence is currently, just off the eastern or the western coast of the United States. So we're definitely seeing a trend towards multiple migrations, and scholars are a lot less confident about the actual date, but they're assuming that a group made it into the Alaska area of North America as early as 43,000 years ago, became isolated, a small group, about 8 to 10,000 people, and possibly even only a smaller portion of that group actually making it into North America, or to the United States portion of North America, as early as about 17,000 years ago. But even this theory is incomplete, and it's even complicated by the fact that we have potential archaeological sites all the way down in South America that are pretty strong and date back, as much as 22,000 years ago. The Monteverde site is particularly problematic, because it is a pretty clear evidence of natives in South America, and very, very far south. You see that all the way down there towards the very bottom of South America. It's a pretty good evidence of a site, and it's well before the Clovis culture sites in North America. So to say this is all wrapped up is to say, yeah, we don't. It's a complex and long and very, very interesting history. Okay, well, one of the more interesting aspects of the Native American culture was the development of agriculture. Now, agriculture was like writing. It was independently developed at multiple points in human culture across the globe. Agriculture developed in South America and in Central America, and likely, even though those regions are pretty close, it was likely independently developed, because there were multiple different crops that were tamed at those locations. I say tame because that's the word that you use for animals. It's not that. It's the other word though, and I'm stumbling over right now. Domesticated. That's the word I'm looking for. But agriculture also happened in the Fertile Crescent region. It also developed in the Southeast Asia. All of these were about 8,000 BC, about 8 to 10,000 years ago. Agriculture in North and South America was a bit behind that, but not much. About 4,000 BC, so about 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, the natives in South America and in Central America both began to domesticate crops. In South America, they domesticated potatoes, they domesticated tomatoes. But interestingly, the real interesting crop is the growth of maize in Central America. You see before you teosinte. I'm going to call it the greatest feat of genetic engineering in the history of humankind, because honestly, you're looking at the forerunner of what we now call corn. Okay? Teosinte comes in both male and female forms, and it is the female form that we eat. The male form is the tassels that are on the top of a corn plant today. Teosinte, back about 5,000 BC, looked a lot like this bushy thing you see there on the left. If you know what it's going to be, you can kind of see it. It has the corn-like leaves, but what will become the ear of corn is very thin. The kernels are hard. They are very small, and you see the size of a quarter there. So lengthwise is about twice the size of a quarter. Compared to an ear of corn that we have today, you see there on the right, it's a single ear of corn that's, I mean, the amount of calories between these two is astronomically different. So changing this into edible corn was, one of the most fantastic aspects of genetic engineering, and it was done the old-fashioned way, where humans would take larger size ears of corn of the earlier teosinte and breed them with other large ears until they eventually got a ear of corn that was edible and sizable enough to feed a population. And when corn got to be into those intermediate sizes, it began to actually feed entire civilizations. Not so much in Central America, but as corn migrated, as trade took corn cultivation throughout North America, it began to be grown with symbiotic crops. We call these the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. And they're symbiotic because they help each other. Obviously, the Native Americans did not know the chemistry of this, but they did understand that when you grow these three things together, you get better yields of all three. Now, they don't understand why. There is some very complicated chemistry that goes in with this. For instance, the beans they take nitrogen from the ground and they add it into the soil, which is that nitrogen is then used by the beans, by the squash and the corn. The corn provides a stalk that the beans can readily climb upon, and so it allows the beans to grow. The squash, when I say squash, I'm saying all kinds of squashes, from zucchini, summer squash, winter squash, and other gourds, and pumpkins, of course. They provide ground cover. If you've ever seen these plants grow, they grow along the ground. They have these huge leaves that block out a lot of light, and so it kills a lot of the weeds that would be competitors for nutrients and resources for all three of these plants, because you can't grow underneath a huge pumpkin leaf. Pumpkins, however, don't have a problem with it. Neither do the beans, because they're growing on the corn, and the corn doesn't have a problem with it because it's already taller than the ground cover that's blocking out the sunlight for the competing weeds. And so you have this symbiotic relationship, and the Native Americans realized that this was a great way to both get a balanced, in many ways, a balanced nutrition through your food sources, and also grow symbiotic crops. The cultures in North America are the ones we're going to be focusing on, of course, because it's a APUS history. We do, of course, have the Central American tribes, but we're going to come around and talk about those when we talk about European colonization more. I want to focus mostly on the ones that would be on the northern portion of North America. There were several variations of the Native American culture before this. We don't really have their names because they are lost to history. They did not leave written records, or if they did, those records have not yet been found. The early woodland period had what we call the Hopewell trading culture. We call them the Hopewell because of their of where the signs of this culture was located, not because that was the name that they called themselves. Same thing with the Mississippian. We call them the Mississippian culture because of their association with the Mississippi River, which itself was a river named after a Native American tribe that was contemporary to the Europeans when they started settling North America. And so there's a lot of this that, we don't know a lot about. We just know from the artifacts and stuff that they've left behind. The Mississippian culture was a huge culture that dominated the Mississippi River Valley area, Ohio River Valley, the eastern woodland area as a whole. They were preceded by what we call the Adena and the Hopewell cultures, as you see here. In Ohio specifically, since that's where we're from, you look at that map on the lower left-hand side there, you see the green areas as the Adena cultures, and you have, mound building cultures from the mounds from the Adena cultures, mounds from the Hopewell, and then later from the mounds from the Fort Ancient cultures that were all predecessors of the Mississippian culture that led up to it. The Mississippian culture we know most predominantly because of their capital that we call Cahokia. You see here on the left Monk's Mound, which is a huge earth mound that was built in the center of Cahokia. And you see on the right an artist's rendition of what it would have been like. Now, the Mississippi River would have flooded these, so these mounds played very useful purposes of, keeping houses and homes up above the floodplains. But the flooding was fine because it helped replenish the soil and made the Mississippi Valley incredibly rich and bountiful in corn. The corn, you were able to grow corn in the Mississippi Valley, and it provided a lot of calories, which was able to feed a lot of mouths. And so you had cities in the Mississippian culture growing to significant size. What do we need to know about the major divisions of native civilizations before Columbus? From an APUSH history standpoint, you need to know that geography is the most important factor in how these civilizations developed, how they adapted to their regions. What resources were plentiful in the regions and how did they make use of them? What was the carrying capacity of the land? For instance, the carrying capacity of the Great Plains was not nearly as bountiful as those in the Northeast and the Southeast, because while there are plenty of animals on the Great Plains, it is hard to get to them. Okay, this is before Columbus. There are no horses in North America, and so if you are on the plains and you are trying to survive, you are either raising corn in sedentary villages. They call these the earth mound villages. Or if you are a hunter-gatherer, you are chasing down a buffalo on foot, and that is hard to do. It can be done, but let's just say you're not getting fat and happy on that, because it's a lot of feast or famine. You kill a buffalo, you eat well, and then for the next month when you can't, you get, it's probably lean times. This of course changes when horses are introduced. So when we talk about the European introductions into North America, you'll want to take note of that as one of the ways that native cultures changed and adapted, by taking, resources that the Europeans brought and then making use of them in their own ways. So how isolated and how connected were these groups? All of these are factors. Okay, I have here several examples of some of the geography and the main resources, and the ones that are highlighted are the ones that you're probably going to want to pay attention to, because those are the ones that are most likely going to show up on the AP test. For instance, the Great Plains. Well, it was a grassland, and buffalo was one of the major food sources. The Northeast and Southwest, well, these were the woodland areas, so they hunted. Deer was a big one, and of course they farmed the Three Sisters. The Southwest, well, it was definitely a desert area, and they were predominantly feasting off the Three Sisters there. California was a mountains, fish, game, nuts, berries, anything you can hunt and gather off the land there. The Great Basin area, this is a desert area, a very dry area in between the Sierra Nevada and the Rocky Mountain ranges. So they were a mix of deserts and mountains, and these were hunters and gatherers, so they survived on of what they could consistently hunt or scrape together from the land. The plateau regions, mountains, rivers, hunters-gatherers, the northwest coast, coastal waterways, fishers, hunters-gatherers, Mesoamericans, Central Highlands, they lived off game and also the Three Sisters, and of course the Caribbean, tropical islands, fishing and hunters and gatherers in there. Subarctic and Arctic, also, the Inuit are the predominant groups in those, and you're going to consist of caribou, seals. Not a lot of farming going on up there. Not any at all, actually. Their diet is almost entirely meat. So you'll also need to know an example, be able to provide an example of a group that would have been from these areas. For instance, the Great Plains. You'll see two different words here. I've provided the first one is the one that you are probably most likely to know this group by. Okay. However, I want to point out something to you. The name that they would call themselves is the name that you see in parentheses there. Why do we not call them by that name? Well, it's a complicated story. For instance, for some of these, we do. Look down at the very bottom, the Taino. Well, we call them the Taino. They no longer exist because they were, when we talk about the European discovery of America, they were the ones that were living on the Hispaniola, island of Hispaniola, and they eventually all died out. The northwest coast, the Chinook, you see that's very similar and sounding to the Tsinuk that they would call themselves. And so in some ways, the European explorers were able to get the right names with the right people. However, look at it this way. You are a European explorer. You're going to make initial contact with a group of natives, okay? You're going to learn their language. You're going to get in contact with them, or you may have a translator. When you ask, who are these people over there, that native group is going to refer to that people the way they would refer to that people. Now, that may be a positive. They may be on good relations with that people, but often they're going to be competitors with that group for land and resources or something else. And so often the name that they are going to use is probably not a nice name. For instance, we know the Great Plain warriors as the Sioux. Well, the Sioux don't call themselves the Sioux. They call themselves the Lakota or Dakota, okay? That is the name that they refer to themselves. Sioux is actually a word that was labeled by them by their enemies. And in fact, that's what that word means, enemy. Often, these words that they call themselves simply mean the people. For instance, the Navajo also means the enemy or some derivation of that. But the word Dene, which is what they call themselves, that just simply means the people. And most of these tribes are going to have, that's their title. They'll call themselves the people in their own language. And so that's what often you will see in their in their names. So I want you to I acknowledge that you probably know these groups as the Navajo, Cherokee, Iroquois, Sioux, Eskimo. I just want you to understand that that's not what they would call themselves, and you will likely see these words being used interchangeably, and it's probably more proper, if you know it, to call them after the name that they would call themselves. After all, you would want to be called the name that you label yourself as. So, all right, that was what we have today, and I hope this gets you properly contextualized in Period 1. Have a great day, and I'll see you later.